Hi, this is Wit, and in this video, I'll be doing the topic analysis for policy neg on the standardized testing topic. To jump right in, there are a few big picture notes about negating on this topic that are different from others. First, this is an empirical debate. You need to be able to talk about the statistics and different mechanisms of analyzing tests fluently in order to be able to engage in basically any debate. All of the common affirmatives that we have talked about that deal with the big picture stock issues, things like socioeconomics, ableism, race, as well as other just general achievement gaps and predictive quality, all in the end come down to statistics. There's no way in which you can determine whether racial groups are negatively or positively impacted by standardized testing without first and foremost analyzing the data that backs it up. Even debates that come down to more ideological angles, such as what we should prioritize, will still require you to have a robust defense of your analysis of testing, and the only way to do that is to be fluent. The second is that you don't need to defend college admissions as they currently are. Obviously, there are major structural issues. Everywhere from differential acceptance rates for things like legacy admissions to many of other issues that may be smaller or larger. Things like lack of college counselors at low-funded schools, the inability for many students to be able to effectively know about all the colleges they have in front of them or get information on things like scholarships. These are not things you need to defend, and they're not necessarily things I've solved. You should not set up the debate so that your negative burden is to win that college admissions are perfect now. Rather, and this is something that will be repeated throughout answering a lot of different things, what is important is to get to the crux of the debate, which is standardized testing, and defend why that itself is good and why it's something that should be maintained, even if, and you should probably defend them, other broader structural reforms should and will exist. So that begs the question, why is testing good in the first place? There are a few main arguments that come from educational reformers that come down to the crux of what's most important. First is standardization. There's no substitute for standardized tests in order to compare different students to each other. While many aspects of schooling, for example, what people learn, how teachers grade, etc., can be extremely variable, standardized tests, their first and foremost priority is in order to have a yardstick at which everyone who takes them can be placed against each other. While someone may not be able to adequately compare between what an A in AP biology means compared to an A in honors biology at another school, being able to say someone got a 760 on the ACT versus a 740 on it is a very accurate measure, largely, compared to those. Additionally, it can help minimize bias. While many other aspects of the admissions process are very variable and prone to things like determining whether someone who sails is more interesting than someone who runs, or whether someone who's really focused on space exploration to someone who's really interested in biology. Well, these, are prone to bias, both at the interviewer level, who might be prone to accept more people of some certain background. Standardized testing allows for a hypothetically neutral yardstick. Of course, many people say that this is largely a sham, and it largely reflects things like who gets access to resources to practice for the test. It reflects things like educational variables. I'm not saying that those don't exist, and in fact, I'll delve much deeper into them, but there is an argument to be made for how standardized testing can reduce that bias. And as I said above, this gets largely to empirical questions that you should be able to defend. Finally, and this deals with the larger why is admissions relevant, or why should certain schools accept some and not others, but to ensure quality college matching. When there's a lot of variables, it is important that people go to colleges that are best suited for their aptitude. Well, obviously, there is a wide range in people who can excel at certain schools. Many people often have issues at schools because they're not able to adequately perform well at them. And of course, this is largely symptomatic of many issues at colleges and universities who are unable to adequately uh, teach students who may come from backgrounds and get them different backgrounds and come up to speed. It is important that people go to colleges that are well suited for them, both at the level of if they're really interested in math. There should be a measure in order for schools that have strong math programs to accept students who are high performing, especially ones who may come from schools that don't normally send students to them. If there's a student who gets an 800 on the SAT, that can indicate they outpace them, even if an A at that school may not necessarily mean the same as an A from a different school. How do you defend the efficacy of testing from a statistical perspective? There are a few main metrics in order to determine them. The most important one, and the one that I think most literature deals with most specifically, is correlation between college outcomes from students who perform well on different measures. Well, there are obviously many measures. Ultimately, what college admissions tries to determine is if a student is a good placement for that school, and whether they will do well there. That is something that can be statistically tested. We can see, do students who perform well on the SAT do better at colleges? And is there a clear correlation between them? If someone who gets a 600 on part of the ACT does far better at a school than someone who gets an 800 on a section of the SAT, then that may indicate that it's not actually a good predictive measure. Additionally, this is also relevant for things like when people say it's an affluence test. If students who are richer do better on the SAT, but don't do better than students who are poorer but do worse on the ACT, that may indicate that there is a significant problem. Additionally, we can measure it against other metrics. To what degree is there variability with those? How well do those perform good college outcomes? This is something that's very important because if other measures are worse, then the fact that the SAT is not good at predicting it may not necessarily be the end-all be-all, because it can still be better. I've included a chart on the right from an article called 8 Myths About College Testing that's on the Dropbox that goes a bit deeper into this correlation. While this data is certainly contested, and there are literature analyses that disagree with them, it's a good instance of a chart that shows the importance of having SAT testing. It shows on currently how well correlation predicts how people do. Well, if you compare it to things like the common curricula and how well people do in terms of GPAs and things like that, it's a strong predictor. It can explain roughly, 65%. In the large scale, doing both GPA plus the SAT reaches nearly 90% or even higher under certain measures. In this alone, those two measures of GPA plus the SAT were able to explain about 80% of college performance. This is extremely indicative that it is not solely an affluence test or solely a measure of someone's background, but it does at least have a strong correlation to the curricula and whether or not it's effective in the first place at causing good college outcomes. This is supplemented when you add things like activities, personal statements, and letters of recommendation that can additionally supplement and determine if someone's a good fit. This is important because while some people may say it's not super accurate or that a GPA is stronger, that alone does not say it all. While a GPA is good, it's not an either-or mutually exclusive. In fact, what the data shows, according to this article, is that a GPA plus SAT is far better than either of them alone, and therefore it makes sense for us to include both when determining the efficacy of it. The other alternatives are things that you should be able to explain are poor tests of it. Not only do statistically they have nearly no correlation with the actual college outcomes, but they're also plagued by major issues. Things like activities are highly determined by socioeconomic status as well as racial opportunities. A student may not have the ability to engage in a large number of outside of school activities if they have to work almost all the time when they're not studying. Some people may have larger external pressures at home and in other areas that mean it's necessary for them to focus on schoolwork. In fact, activities can often be a much stronger indicator of affluence than something like the SAT because they're not standardized, and often people can even fake activities, as we saw in things like the college admission scandal. Additionally, personal statements are much bolstered by people who have access to outside college counselors, can work extensively on explaining their essay, etc., while many people with less resources may not have the same amount of time or resources, while people at private schools may have access to college counselors who can review their essay every week, give essay writing workshops. Those sorts of resources just don't exist at many other schools. Letters of recommendation, likewise, are often rushed and less quality at public schools and schools with much higher student bodies because of the fact that there are far more less teachers for each amount of students, which means that teachers may not have the same opportunity to get a personal connection. Letters of recommendation from things like employers may be less prevalent, etc. And thus, you should point out that many of the alternatives, which colleges, to clarify, are forced to rely on in a world without standardized testing, are significantly worse. Even things like a GPA have major problems because they're not standardized. A 4.0 at one school may be very different from a 4.0 at another school. Things like different opportunities for extracurriculars or AP tests, and other sort of metrics that do contribute to GPA. I guess when I say extracurriculars, I mean non-academic classes. Those are all heavily determined by what the school offers, how grading works, and things like grade inflation can heavily tip the scales on those. They also have the same problems with sort of affluence tests and racial gaps because they're also strongly correlated with the ability to have things like outside tutors and have less pressures at home. These all mean that you should point out that the alternatives are significantly worse than testing in many cases, because testing, while obviously still affected by things like tutoring, isn't something that can be solely determined by whether or not, or not something that can be solely determined by just outside affluence. I'll talk about that now. So in terms of socioeconomic bias, this is a common critique of the SAT and ACT. What's important in terms of the statistics debate is isolating testing bias against large-scale educational disparities. Well, I'm sure you've seen the charts that show that people who make more money are far more likely to do well on the SAT. This does not tell the whole story. This doesn't necessarily indicate that the SAT is the reason for these gaps. In fact, the data shows that it's far worse in terms of opportunity because of the fact that people who have lower access to socioeconomic resources, in fact, don't have the same access to things like education, educational quality. There are many other issues plaguing, such as many public schools are vastly underfunded, while richer people are able to go to private schools, and schools that give them more opportunities. In fact, the average high socioeconomic status student obviously does much better, but the variability within that range is not significantly different than the variability overall. The difference, while significant, is not necessarily that different from what you'd expect in terms of variability in terms of activities or GPA. When controlling for educational status, socioeconomic status, predictive accuracy stays around 90%, according to the same study I referenced in the previous article, but which shows that there is a strong ability for it to predict outcomes. In fact, if you look at the people who get high scores or who have high socioeconomic status, those people are generally, in terms of average scores, obviously doing better, but still nowhere near the ACT or SAT scores required to go to somewhere like an Ivy League or even top 50 university. Well, obviously, that's not the most important thing in terms of education. The fact is, even the average person is unable to just buy an 800 ACT score. In fact, that's shown by things like the admissions scandal recently, where people, in fact, had to pay money in order to do that, which shows that it's not enough for that alone to matter. In fact, it also demonstrates things like legacy admissions matter more because they're able to sidestep the main issues within the debate by simply paying their way out of a score, which is the reason some people say we need to increase focus on things like standardized testing rather than decrease them. The racial disparity debate is very similar to the socioeconomic status debate. What's important to note is that alternatives are significantly more prone to bias for many of the reasons talked about in previous debates, in the previous slide. Things like educational segregation, the fact that many white families have increased resources and that white students go to private schools at a far higher rate than other minority groups, demonstrates that there are issues in terms of the very opportunity people have to perform well in the first place. What you should be pointing out almost writ large is that it's symptomatic rather than a cause of larger social issues. I won't go too much into this because I think most of the debate is heavily covered by the same arguments as the socioeconomic status debate, but what's important is that you use counterplans to your advantage. You can resolve many of these issues, and I'll talk about them in the coming slides. But in the end, the fact is that the debate isn't necessarily a question of whether the educational system is racist or biased against poor students, but rather that that things like standardized testing are symptoms of it, and that you can resolve them, but solving testing is not what's going to solve the problem. I'll now talk about counterplans. Reform counterplans are able to solve many AF advantages. You can talk about defend efficacy of things like adversity scores, which allow for adjustments in terms of it. This is something the ACT recently implemented in order to minimize things like bias. It allows for the interaction of things like where someone is from and the access they had to education, and uses that to create a score that demonstrates the adversity someone had to take in the test. I will say that this has faced heavy criticism from many different angles recently, but there are also a lot of articles defending them, and it's not something you should just immediately write off, because while it may not be the best implementation, measures along these lines are able to control for it to some degree. Testing optional policies are also something that's important, because while the affirmative has to defend that they should never be considered, test optional policies may be a better middle ground between the two. They allow for students who feel that the test would be biased against them, or that they don't have the time to study for the test, to not take it, while still having the opportunity to let the other parts of their application show themselves, while still allowing students who perform well on them to use it. For example, a student who goes to a high school that may be written off by college admissions counselors can prove that their 4.0 isn't merely a fluke, but rather that they are able to have educational aptitude, which can minimize bias in other aspects of it, while students who feel that they aren't performing the best on it do not have to do it, which turns it into things like subject tests at many schools, where things like the SAT can be optional but submitted by students who view them as best for them. There are also many structural changes at both the college and SAT level that can minimize significant harms to it. Things like no-fee applications that mean people do not have to pay in order to take the test can minimize some socioeconomic issues and allow students to take it as many times as they want, whereas many students have to choose between taking another time or saving money that could be used for other things. Counterplans can improve outreach towards students to help them know about college and scholarship opportunities, both for standardized testing, like things like fee waivers, as well as at the college level to minimize biases in terms of admissions, as well as differential outcomes. There are reforms that can occur at the K through 12 level that can minimize educational gaps that materialize as gaps in terms of standardized testing. You should look in terms of not just the standardized testing literature, but the broader educational reform literature when doing research and defending counterplans, because many of the issues stem from rather than are caused by standardized testing, and even if abolishing standardized testing can partially ameliorate them, there is no better alternative than something that actually reforms testing reforms the educational system at its root, and there is no limitation on the number of people in the literature who are currently defending that. One final thing I'll talk about is counterplans that use testing gaps in order to cause reforms. Things like standardized testing at both the high school and college admissions level are very often used as those gaps are used to demonstrate where education needs to be fixed. If there are major gaps between students at a certain school, between how they're doing at that school and how they're doing on standardized testing, that can indicate that there are places where those reforms can be targeted and cause change, which means that the data from standardized testing itself can be used in order to effectively cause changes at the standardized testing and educational level. I'll also talk about picks. You can defend certain tests while still abolishing things like the SAT and ACT. Certain people in literature say we should abolish others but keep the subject tests because they can allow students to demonstrate aptitude in places where their schools may not allow them to. For example, if a school does not have a robust program in something like biology, students can self-study and demonstrate their aptitude on the subject test. It's similar for things like AP tests. Colleges currently do consider them, and for many students, it allows for a standardized measure of their high school education. And in places that their schools may not offer education, things like European history, computer science, students can self-study and then use their scores on that in order to demonstrate aptitude for colleges. These can help minimize issues, and some educational literature says that they have much less issues in terms of bias than they do on the SAT and ACT because they're much more targeted, and students get to choose what they're best at rather than being forced to take it. They're also optional, which causes many of the benefits that I talked about on the arguments regarding the test optional counterpoint. You should also explore picks an area of education. Some people say that there are certain standardized tests, ones that you may not have even heard of, that are very important. For example, for military school, it's important to be able to have a testing of people's ability on things like how well they can see, as well as other things that are relevant for a specific military capability. There are certain standardized tests that apply for military schools that don't apply otherwise, that you can develop into something like a readiness advantage for a DISAD, or something along those lines, because you can argue that military schools are important. There are also things like medical and nursing programs at the undergraduate level that do require standardized testing to some degree. Some colleges and universities even have joint programs like Brown that allow you to apply to both the medical school and when you're applying for undergraduate level education, which means that for some of these places, it's really, really important for, people's lives and due to the nature of the job they're going into, to be able to effectively filter between applicants. And you can defend those as picks and say that they should still be used in certain areas. The final thing I'll talk about is DISADs. Obviously, DISADs are going to be a difficult debate to win, no matter what. Because of the fact that it's a small topic, AFs are not forced to defend the USFG, and it's not necessarily an issue that lends itself to big stick impacts. However, you should explore impacts in terms of the quality of testing in areas of things like competitiveness, where you can defend that it's very important for us to have a robust educational system and that our innovation at even the undergrad level is very important because, one, it's a filter up to higher education, but two, because even at the undergraduate level, there is important research being done and that determines whether people are good at their jobs and things like that. If our top programs are not getting the top people, you can say that can cause long-run harmful impacts to the quality of the American job sector, innovation, and things like that, all of which are very important and can be developed into impacts like hegemony, innovation, etc., that can be used as big stick impacts. These will obviously be hard to impact in the grand scheme of just testing good, but if you target it towards specific programs with specific arguments, or even pair it with picks like AP tests, you can try to generate larger impacts while minimizing AF offense. There are also, of course, things like politics to educational reform that you can pair with things like the state reform counterplan and things like federalism. The problem with these is obviously that I think smart AFs will defend public colleges and universities as the actor rather than defending the USFG. But if AFs defend them, these are also always things that can be offended as very important, and things like federalism is important and often talked about at the level of education. Therefore, this should be a very interesting topic for negating because you'll have to make smaller case and contingent arguments that rely on statistical analysis and getting really deep into the topic literature. So if I had one thing to say, it's that you should read literature reviews, meta-analyses, statistics, etc., and use that to be able to talk fluently about the case, because this will be a hard topic to win if you can't beat back most AFs at the level of their main contention.